Are you wanting to get inside the rear drums of your Polo? Maybe to change the brake shoes? Or maybe you've got a leaking wheel cylinder? Well, come with me, let me show you how. Before you remove the wheel, make sure the car is safely supported on axle stands, and chock a front wheel too. Now if the drum's in any way tight on the brake shoes, you need to release the self-adjuster and release the shoes. And you do that with a little lever just inside here. Hold the drum in position, lift the lever up and it releases the brake shoes. With a number 3 crosshead, take out the drum retaining screw and withdraw the drum. Just to clarify and help you know what you were releasing there, this wedge here is the self-adjusting wedge. What you were doing was putting a screwdriver, flat blade screwdriver, through the wheel nut hole onto the underside of the wedge. Hold the drum and hence hub in position. Press down on this end, which pushes up the wedge, and that releases the shoes. If you're planning on reusing the brake shoes that are in here, or you're just servicing the brakes, maybe to free them up, get rid of the dust, or maybe you're only replacing the cylinder, then do check the thickness of the friction material. Now the minimum thickness that you should allow it to go down to is 1.5 millimeters. So measure the thickness of the backing plate, 3.8. Measure the total thickness there, 6.9. That means I've got 3.1 millimeters of material, so I've got plenty of meat on there. However, I am changing these shoes. The reason I'm changing these shoes is because I had a cylinder leak on the other side of the car, and you should always change both sides at the same time. The workshop manual for these says that to get the brake shoes off, you should remove the hub first. That's great if you've got a suitable size socket to get at the hub nut, along with a decent breaker bar. Not to mention you'll need the torque wrench for putting it back on afterwards, along with an angle gauge to tighten it up correctly. If you haven't got that equipment or don't want to invest in it, then an alternative method that I've discovered while I was doing the other side is to remove the wheel cylinder, which of course if you're replacing the wheel cylinder isn't an issue. Now if you're not replacing the wheel cylinder, that is similarly not a problem. All you need to do is bleed the brakes a little bit afterwards, but that's fine. I would always recommend that whenever you put new pads or put new shoes in drums, that you always give that brake a little bit of a bleed. First job, compress the retaining cup springs and take the retaining pins out. Also a good tip, use a tray. Put all the bits in the tray, and also it'll catch any dirt and muck and bullets that are dropping down, so it doesn't just land on your drive and you don't walk it in the house. Next step is to release the brake shoes from the lower retainer in the drum mechanism. I find a pair of pipe grips to be good, because you can use the pipe grips to lift the shoes out of the retainer and take the spring off from the bottom. If at this stage you had removed the hub, you would now be able to lift the shoes away and you'd be able to replace them in the reverse order. But I haven't removed the hub, so now I need to remove the wheel cylinder. Now at this stage, the first thing to do, remove the dust cap from the bleed nipple. 7mm socket. A deep socket is best, but I think an ordinary socket will fit. Make sure that the bleed nipple can be released successfully, and then just nip it back up. Put a proper brake hose clamp on the flexible hose. Don't be tempted, please, to use a big pair of pliers or a set of mole grips, anything like that. Those tools are a bit too vicious for the job, and they have a tendency to crush the internals of the hose. Further down in the description I'll put a load of useful links, and I'll link you to one of these. Now you need to undo the brake pipe from the back of the wheel cylinder. Give it a little bit of a wire brush all round. I'm using a small steel wire brush. Do the same round the bleed nipple as well. Give it a spray with brake cleaner. Give the brake cleaner a couple of minutes to dry off. With an 11mm spanner, undo the union. Once you've undone it about a turn, I like to give it another little wire, gentle wire brushing and another spray. Make sure that you've undone the union all the way, but don't be tempted to bend the brake pipe back. With a T30 Torx bit, remove the retaining screw for the cylinder. Finally, remove the bleed nipple with your 7mm socket. Lift the top of the brake shoes away from the cylinder. Give it a little knock from behind if needs be. Keep that safe and somewhere clean. Rotate the shoe assembly round clockwise. The bottom here, you'll see the handbrake cable is attached to its lever. Pull the lever out, disconnect the handbrake. Now, quick look at the self-adjusting mechanism. This is the self-adjusting wedge. As you can see, it gets wider as you go to the top. It's got a spring there. As the pistons push the shoes apart at the top under braking action, that little gap there between the shoe and this yoke opens, and this spring pulls the wedge down into that gap. Next job now is to remove the self-adjust spring. If I turn this round, we now need to remove this small spring which connects the yoke to the trailing shoe. With the assembly in your lap, get a big screwdriver and push that hook through that hole. Spin the assembly round, push the handbrake operating lever outwards, and the yoke will come down and you can separate the two halves. Remove the self-adjusting spring completely and put that safe. Now we need to separate the yoke from the trailing shoe by undoing this spring. Now you can do this with a pair of pipe grips. Pull the spring hoop round to there, bring it the rest of the way, perhaps with a screwdriver. Remove the spring from there. Don't forget to rescue the self-adjust wedge, and then away comes the yoke. Take your new shoe, fit the yoke into position along with the retention spring and the self-adjust wedge. Make sure when you put the wedge in that the pip on this side is away from that back plate. We now need to pull this spring back round the end of the yoke. And this is just one method that I've found for this. I'm using a 5mm good quality tie wrap to stretch the spring, get the end into that gap, cut the tie wrap, and then with a pair of pliers pull it out, and now the spring is back into place along with the self-adjust wedge. Now, before you put it all back together any further, give everything a little clean up. Now I'm going to give the cylinder a clean up. I'm using a normal 5.5mm 1/4" socket in there to which I'll use to stop, make sure that dirt doesn't go into the cylinder hole, and put the bleed nipple back into place and just give it a quick wire brushing. Give the bleed nipple a clean, a blast with cleaner, also give it a blast through, and then put that somewhere safe and clean to dry. Now you can remove the pistons from the cylinder and give it a good clean out. Make sure there's no dust and dirt. Make sure you don't forget to put the spring back in. You'll see that on the ends of the pistons there's a little notch, I suppose you could say, to stop the brake shoes from slipping off. That notch wants to be on the outer side of the cylinder. Give the back plate a little wire brushing down to clean it up. By the way, that there is the ABS sensor. Now we need to reassemble the two new brake shoes into an assembly where they're connected together. That's the orientation in which they need to go. So that's looking at the front. Swing the handbrake lever outwards and you'll see that it fits inside there. Then slide the brake lever down into the yoke, and at this position swing it back towards its back plate. The spring that holds them, this end needs to go through there, this end goes in there. Now put the spring back on the self-adjust wedge and down into the shoe. Now we're ready to put it back onto the back plate. If you pull the handbrake lever out a little, and having got it back into position, swing the brake pads around the hub. Now you can put the cylinder back in, put the holding screw back in, nip the screw up, slot the brake pads back into position on the pistons. Now put the lower return spring back into place and spread the bottom of the shoes to put the shoes into position in the lower bracket. Now put the retaining pins into position, put them in through the back, hole in the back plate, through their hole on the shoe, and put the spring and the retainer into position. And I recommend lining it up by turning the pin, push the retainer down against the spring pressure, turn the pin and release. And the same on the other side. Just a word of caution, no oil or lubrication anywhere. Give your drum a run round on the inside with some 60 or 100 grit emery, and then put it back into position, not forgetting to line up the retaining hole. You might want to knock it on with a soft mallet. Bring the hub round to line up, put your retaining screw back in, if you give the handbrake in the car a pull and release 2 or 3 times, that'll help to position the shoes. Now put the brake pipe back into the rear of the cylinder, nip it up, hand tight. Don't forget to put the bleed nipple back. Do not forget this bit. Remove the brake hose clamp. Do not forget to remove the brake hose clamp. And now we need to bleed this brake. To bleed the brake, undo the bleed nipple about half a turn, one-way valve easy bleeder, connect that to the end of the bleed nipple, then round the threads of the nipple put a couple of drops of brake fluid. That just helps to stop air getting sucked back in past the threads. Now go and check the fluid level in the brake fluid reservoir. Once you've pumped the brake pedal 10 or 15 times, nip up the bleed nipple, hand tight, dust cap back on the bleed nipple. Don't forget to top up your brake fluid reservoir. All that remains now is to put the wheel back on and put the car back down on its wheels. If this is the first time at my channel, don't forget to subscribe if you want to learn more about how to maintain your own car. If you found this video useful, give it a thumbs up, and if you've got any experience or knowledge that you can impart to help others out, add it into the comments below. And I hope to see you on the other side of that screen sometime soon. Bye for now.